So the video froze on me there for some reason, so I was cut off. I think I was saying something to the effect of, right? Hopefully this makes some sense to you, banging your head into it. Now, this should, between the reading and the video here, maybe watching it more than once, but again, I expect this may raise some questions, and I'm hoping that we get some questions when we convene for class. Okay, so what this ends up doing here, finding myself a nice new marker, is now let's take this out for a ride. Okay, so we have an individual supply schedule with one firm in the market. And let's say this is your demand schedule for whatever this good is. Let's talk about those teaching guides, right? And so you discover that there's a market for this. And so as a result, you are going to produce this quantity here and charge this price here. Again, you're probably going to get it wrong at first. You might produce too many units, you might produce too few, but eventually we would expect that you're going to end up figuring it out. Okay. And what's happening? Consumers are better off. They're getting this here, and you are getting that sweet, sweet profit right there. Positive economic profit. Now, what is that positive economic profit? It's a big neon sign over your head telling other people, come copy me. And so somebody else is probably going to notice this. And what are they going to do? Well, assuming they have the same cost function that you do, that will yield the same supply schedule. Now what's going to happen? Well, at this price, you're going to produce this quantity here, and they're going to produce that same quantity, which means that would be your aggregate quantity. If this was the price, you would produce this quantity and they would produce this quantity. If this was the price, they would produce this quantity and you would produce that quantity for an aggregate there. So this would be our supply schedule with two firms in the market. Now there's no reason why it lines up right there. I just happened to have it be that way. So this then would be our aggregate supply schedule with two firms in the market. And so of course now we have to ask what happens next. Well, at this price, we have this being the quantity demanded and this being the quantity supplied. We have too much stuff. And so the reaction, of course, is going to be that we would expect, once people figure this out and sort of sort things out, that the price would fall and the quantity will increase. And so now the question is this good for society? And is it good for you as a producer? Well, as an incumbent producer, so this would be our starting price and this would be our new price. Producer surplus beforehand was B and E. Producer surplus afterwards is E, F, and G. However, your producer surplus beforehand, you got all of that. And now you are selling this quantity right here and receiving this price right here, and this is all your cost, and so you as an individual are left with only E. So you have lost B. Your profit has gone down. Now the other producer who's entered is making positive economic profit. Of course, for us as economists, the question would be what has happened to total surplus. As a result of this other person entering, total surplus has gone up by D, C, F, and G. If you don't see that immediately, and not necessarily saying you should turn the crank on it. So because we're going to be at this quantity here, on this demand schedule here, so this will be our total benefit as a society, and this, all of this here represents our total cost. So it's clear, this is basically what I was trying to explain with when we were talking about lobbying. It's clear that you are going to have a strong incentive to oppose this because you lose B. However, consumers gain C, D, F, and G. The issue, of course, is that C, D, F, well, actually, they end up gaining the impact on their consumer surplus is B, C, and D, actually. So they gain B, C, and D, which is bigger than your loss, which is B. And so they should have an incentive to lobby as well, except for B, C, and D is spread across a lot of people. Whereas B here, your loss, is concentrated in just you. So of course, what happens next? So makes sense. Somebody's going to copy you. But now what's true? You're both still holding signs over your heads, and somebody else is going to have an incentive to imitate. And if they are like everybody else, they're going to produce, right? And so here would be the supply schedule with 3 firms in the market. Every individual firm has that supply schedule, but when we add 3 of them up, we end up with our aggregate supply schedule right here. And so, of course, what happens next? Well, initially, there's a surplus. And of course, unsold goods send information, and we end up getting the price to fall to here. And so again, your profit now is only that area. You're upset, but we as a society have now gained this whole area here. So this is good for society, although bad for producers. Of course, where do we end up? Where are we going to end up? Now, right, so this is a dynamic process. If we're looking at any one day, it may take a little while for producers to enter the market. But eventually, where would we expect to end up? Well, let's see. Basically, we would expect people to enter this market as long as economic profit is greater than 0. And so in order for us to be stable, in order for people to have no incentive to enter, eventually what we're going to have is an individual supply schedule like that for every firm in the market, assuming everybody's the same. We can relax that assumption in a moment. And an aggregate supply schedule that looks like this. At which point, economic profit for the producers, producer surplus, just put some letters in here. Producer surplus, 0. Consumer surplus, A. Government, 0. Total surplus, A. And so in a competitive market, we now have a situation. So this is, at least for me, this is sort of an elegant solution to our puzzle. We still have upward sloping individual supply schedules. And we still have upward short-term supply schedules because if demand increased, then the price would go up, of course, causing some economic profit, signaling to people, communicating information, and giving them incentives to act on that information to enter the market. And so this is why, while in the long term, we have horizontal aggregate supply schedules, even though we still have upward sloping individual supply schedules. So we don't break our law of supply. There still is a positive relationship between the benefit and the quantity supplied. However, almost never would we expect the benefit to increase for the producers. Because what would happen is, of course, if we were out here, eventually what would happen? Somebody else would enter and imitate, assuming they can. So this raises some interesting questions. One would be, or at least for me, now we could revisit who pays a tax. In a competitive market, who pays a tax? Let's see. So when we have a competitive market, we have more or less a horizontal aggregate supply schedule, even though the individual supply schedule is upward sloping. And so suppliers have to receive this much or else they are not going to produce. They're going to go do something else. So when we put the tax on, the benefit to producers and the cost to consumers, it turns out the benefit to the producers has to equal the cost of the consumers minus the tax. That's nothing new. The issue here is that this here has to be producer surplus, or sorry, the price, the benefit to producers, the price to suppliers, in other words. And so what will happen? Say this is the amount of the tax. In effect, what will happen is something you've already seen on a homework. You saw, and so in that case, who pays the tax? Well, that becomes government, and who pays it? Maybe I should put some letters in here. So in competitive markets, let's put some A, B, C, D, and E. Consumer surplus 1 was A, B, and C. Producer surplus 1 was 0. Government 1 was 0. And total surplus 1 was A, B, and C. With the tax, consumer surplus 2 is now A. They get all of this benefit, and they give up this here. Producer surplus 2 is 0, government 2 is B, and total surplus 2 is A and B. So we've lost this here. That's the deadweight loss, or the value of trades that no longer take place. And who pays the entirety of the tax? Consumers do. Consumers pay the whole tax. Because in a competitive industry, if producers paid any of the tax, they would go out of business. They would go do something else. So that's one, I think, interesting implication of this, is that in competitive industries, we almost certainly would not, basically, it doesn't matter whether we raise the tax on the producers or we raise the tax from the consumers. The consumers are going to pay the tax, the whole tax, which means, right, people, Bernie Sanders, he recently dropped out of the election race, but he was big saying, we need to make sure that companies pay their fair share. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter whether we want them to pay their fair share or not. In competitive industries, they're not going to pay anything. They're going to, we may collect the tax from them. They may send in the check. But what they will then do, of course, is increase their price to the consumers and reduce the quantity that's being produced. And consumers are going to pay the entirety of the tax. So that's one implication of this, which I find deeply informative, and I think a little discouraging for some of these social welfare policies that say we're not going to tax consumers. We're going to tax producers. Well, no, you're not. But we are. We're going to collect the tax from them. Yes, you are. But they're not going to pay it. Yeah, they are. They're going to send in the check. Yeah, they're going to send in the check, but they're not going to pay it. They're not the ones who are going to have their well-being reduced. It is all going to come from the consumers. And again, this would be something where I would argue that corporate taxes are a nice example of moving the seen to the unseen. I don't think most consumers walk around realizing that a corporate tax means they pay higher prices. I don't think most of them walk around realizing that a corporate tax reduces their well-being. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. And so I think by increasing corporate tax rates, corporations go, oh, okay, so we're all going to have to increase our prices. That's really what they'll say. They know that their profit margin needs to be their profit margin, or they're not going to be able to get money from their investors because their investors have alternative things to do with their capital. And so they realize this. And so they kind of see, if you talk to people in business, they generally understand that corporate tax rates are political theater. They're not real world implications. What they are is just a tax on consumers, regardless of who we collect the tax from. Okay, so I'm going to stop this here and record another one on sort of some other implications here, and we'll come back straight away.